Okay, so welcome to our first sort of substantive class with respect to political philosophy. The first of many classes where we're going to be taking a deep dive into the text that we'll be considering. It is traditional for all political philosophy classes essentially to start with one fundamental text, and that is the Apology by Plato. So we are not in any way being innovative by imposing that upon you today. What we're going to do today is we're going to try to go through the Apology, through the text of the Apology, to explain what is going on in the text. That's obviously our first and most important goal. And then to try and tease out why it is such an important text to the practice, to the understanding, to the philosophy of politics. What's going on in this text that makes it such an important document. So let's start by considering what the Apology is, why it was written, who wrote it, and the like, its context. So the first problem for English speakers or speakers of Western languages is that the word apology today has come to mean some sort of an excuse. You apologize when you do something wrong. But that meaning of the word apology is a relatively modern one. Apology also means a defense. Apologia means to defend yourself against something. So Plato's so-called Apology of Socrates is better described as Socrates' defense, the defense that Socrates offers at this trial that was held in 399 BCE. And I should note that in this class I will be using the convention of before Common Era BCE and Common Era CE, which correlates to BC and AD. So it is a defense of the trial that was held in Athens in 399, at which Socrates was accused of several crimes. We'll consider what they are. Subsequently condemned, and finally executed. Socrates' life ends in 399 when he was the age of 71. So the question is, what was the context that led to this trial and then his subsequent imprisonment and execution? We don't have nearly enough time to be able to get into the details, but broadly speaking, this text, this episode, this experience falls within a broader period of Greek history, the so-called period of the Peloponnesian Wars. So the Peloponnesian Wars was essentially a fight for supremacy over the Peloponnese, which is part of Greece. And the two main actors in that conflict, does anybody know? Does anyone remember from their... Sparta and Athens, indeed. So it's your typical war in which two people are fighting each other for supremacy over the other neighboring dominions. And the idea is that in this peninsula, in this sort of region of Greece, there's all these small city-states, with Sparta and Athens being by far and away the two largest, most dominant city-states. And so whoever gains supremacy over the other, then can assert supremacy over the sort of larger territorial region. And that matters in terms of being paid tribute, money, material, and so on and so forth. So Athens and Sparta, for about 3 decades, engage in this conflict, which we call today the Peloponnesian Wars, which starts in the final third of the 5th century BCE, typically dates to 431, and ends in 404, which is to say 5 years or even less than 5 years before this famous trial begins. The war comes to an end in 404 with the capitulation of Athens, and immediately after the capitulation of Athens, the Spartans establish what we would call an oligarchy over the Athenians, known as the Tyranny of the 30, named after the 30 people who were the tyrants of Athens. So for the year after the end of the war, Athenian democracy, the mainstay of Athenian political life, Athenian democracy is suspended, and it's not restored until late 403. So it's in the context of this conflict that we then see Socrates put on trial. And broadly speaking, we might say that it's the consequence of this sense of chaos that has engulfed Athens, the war that it fought, the war that it lost, the things that went wrong, that the city is seeking to understand what happened. Why did we not prevail? What was going on inside Athens that we, the Athenians, were not able to prevail over Sparta? Because indeed the Athenians claim for themselves, as indeed the Spartans did for themselves, that their version of politics, of civilization, of organizing life was superior to that of the Spartans. So the question is, if they have a better system, why did they not prevail? Part of the humiliation of the Peloponnesian War, or the humiliation of the Athenian surrender, ties back to exactly, as is mentioned, the so-called Sicilian expedition in 415, 413, in which an Athenian navy set sail for today the modern island of Sicily, which at the time was populated by Greek colonies being essentially satellite cities that tie back to a main city on the Greek mainland. And that expedition ended in total disaster for the Athenian forces. They were routed. Many men were killed or taken prisoner. The Sicilian expedition was led by a very, very famous Athenian general and leader whose name was Alcibiades. And Alcibiades, and we, as I say, since it's not a class on Greek history, we won't go into it particularly, but Alcibiades was a famous and notorious Athenian figure. Among other things, he was the lead general, a lead strategist of the Athenian campaign in the Peloponnesian War, but later he famously defected to the other side. He switched switched sides and joined the Spartan forces against his former city. Eventually he came back to Athens and again disgraced himself, and he finally was sent into exile in the year 406, so shortly before the Athenian capitulation. The reason this matters is because Alcibiades, as a sort of young Athenian, had been given lessons, had taken instruction from a famous Athenian philosopher whose name was Socrates. So Alcibiades, the famous Athenian general, his tutor, the person he had learned from, was Socrates. Now, if you read the sort of typical accounts of this, what you'll find is that the link is that Alcibiades learned certain ways of Socratic wisdom and thinking and so on and so forth. But I will mention, because it's kind of funny, the kind of incident that perhaps may have led the Athenians to look upon Socrates as the teacher of Alcibiades with some suspicion, because the link then between teacher and student in this context is very close. The teacher instructs the student essentially enacts the wisdom of the teacher. And the story is told that on the eve of the Sicilian expedition in 415, that the Athenian navy, prior to its departing for Sicily, decided to engage, as young men have done throughout all time, engage in some carousing and drinking the night before they set off to sail for the Sicilian island. So they all went out and they got drunk, and then they got rowdy. And one of them had a great idea. They said, wouldn't it be a very funny thing if we went around and we defaced the so-called Hermes statues that are around the city? And at the time, around the city of Athens, there were these small statuettes, sort of small things made out of stone, which were sort of part protection, part fertility symbol. And their primary characteristic was they had a large, erect male penis attached to the statue. And so these young men thought that it would be extremely funny, you can guess what they wanted to do, was to go around and knock off the members of this statue, which indeed in their drunken state they did, and they thought it was hilarious. Then they set sail for Sicily, and the entire expedition collapsed, failed disastrously. So a lot of people link these two incidents. If you disrespect our customs and so on, then this is the kind of thing that happens. It's not that you lost because of failed strategy, you lost in part because you incurred the displeasure of the gods. And that then creates a link between the behavior, the actions of these young men who might engage in this form of penile iconoclasm, and the instructor who might have led them into error, right? Who's the person who would lead people to even think in this way? So this kind of creates then this aura of suspicion around Socrates. And so in the context then of this crisis that has engulfed the Athenian city-state at the end of the 5th century BCE, Socrates is hauled up by his fellow Athenian citizens and he is put on trial. And the nature of an Athenian trial was that you would be convened in front of your fellow citizens, the charges would be read out, and then you had the opportunity to offer a defense. And so what we have in the text here that starts our class is, the authenticity of the text is widely disputed, is a version of the statement that Socrates offered on the occasion of his trial to defend himself against the charges that were brought. We have several versions of, we have two versions of the defense that Socrates offers. We have the version written by Plato and another version written by another one of his students. The Platonic text is, of course, by far and away the most famous, but the value of having a second document attests then to the historical validity of this event. Whether the text offered by Plato is in any way connected to what Socrates himself actually said, of course we cannot know. But the fact is that it does seem clear that Socrates, first of all, was a real person, that he was put on trial, and that these elements did in some way come together. As Socrates makes clear from his text, it's not just one person with whom he has a dispute. Essentially, he is put on trial by the entire city of Athens. It is essentially Socrates against the Athenian polity. And the charges specifically that are raised against him are that he is guilty of two, or that he is being charged with two things. The first is that he is guilty of blasphemy, which is speaking against the gods, right? So in fact, the specific charge that Socrates refers to in the text is that he doesn't believe in the gods of Athens, right? That he is rejecting the Athenian gods. Today we would call it a kind of heresy. But blasphemy is to go against the gods. So that's the first charge. And the second charge is corruption of Athenian youth. By virtue of his teaching, he has corrupted those who have learned from him, right? Sort of as if you left this classroom and then did something terrible, and you said, well, it's not my fault, my teacher told me that this is what I should do, and so then they haul me up to sort of be answerable, responsible for all the nonsense that I'm saying up here. So those are the two charges, blasphemy and corruption of the youth. If you go back to that little incident that I mentioned, when the rowdy naval members of the Athenian Navy went around and disfigured these icons around the city of Athens, you can see that it links together, because on the one hand you have a bunch of youth who have been inspired, at least some of them, by Socrates, and what is it they do before the day of the big expedition? They go around and they engage in this anti-religious, iconoclastic behavior. So that one incident, in a sense, serves to summarize the charges that are being brought against Socrates. Teaching bad things, right? Turning good people into bad people as a result of what you are saying, right? Of what you are teaching. So what Socrates does is he frames his defense, and this is, I think, the way that, in terms of the structure of the apology, he frames his defense in two parts. In the first part, he explains why he is on trial, right? So he makes an argument to say, here is the reason why I am here. Here's the reason why you think that I have blasphemed against the gods and corrupted the youth. And in the second part, he turns the trial around, and he takes the opportunity to put Athens on trial. So the first part, he essentially mounts a defense. He explains why it is that he is there being charged. And in the second part, he throws back the charges and in the face of those who have accused him. And so in that sense, the accused becomes the accuser. And there is this pivot point, what I would call a fulcrum, in the text, where you can see Socrates moves from defending himself to launching into an accusation against Athens. And in a sense, it all linked to this larger environment, which is, I will now explain why you Athenians not only have put me on trial, but the crimes of which you are guilty, the things of which you are guilty. And that will then help explain why the Athenian democracy here at the end of the 5th century, at the beginning of the 4th century BCE, is in the state that it is in. You know the old phrase that offense is the best defense? Essentially, Socrates adopts that methodology. After he's done explaining why it is that he is on trial, he then uses this trial as an opportunity to then throw back the accusation and put Athens on trial. And in so doing, he provides us with some interesting insights and thoughts about what it means to lead a political life, and also what citizenship means. And so from that second part, from this discussion, we come up with this idea of what we might call the Socratic citizen, or a model of Socratic citizenship. It's not an easy model, as we will see. It is, in fact, quite puzzling.